As our final data structure, let's look at data frames. Here are the characteristics of a data frame. A data frame is just a list, but it's a list of equal length vectors, so it's a special kind of list. Vectors are represented in columns of the data frame. Each vector is an atomic vector, but data types can differ across vectors. Columns and rows must be named. The class of a data frame is data.frame. And there are three default attributes to a data frame: class, names with the column names, and row.names with the row names. The easiest way to think of a data frame is to envision a spreadsheet. You have your units of analysis in your rows. You have your variables in your columns. Every column will contain the same kind of data, but columns can differ from one another in the data they contain. That is the essence of a data frame. So a data frame is like R's version of a spreadsheet. Let's look at how we create a data frame. We can create data frames by entering the data within our script, but it's far more common to read in the data using one of the read functions. You can also create data frames by binding vectors together, either into columns or rows. We'll see examples of all of these. Let's start out by entering data into a data frame using the data.frame function where we supply the data. Now note, data frames have to have names to columns and names to rows. So here I am specifying the names for the columns: ID, name, and score. Let's look at the characteristics of the data frame I just created. The class is data.frame. The attributes are the names, ID, name, and score, the class, and the row names. Note that I did not supply those row names, but R gave it to them automatically. We can look at the structure of my data using the str function, showing us that ID is an integer vector, name is a character vector, and score is a numeric vector. Let's actually look at my data. ID is a column, name is a column, score is a column. The 1, 2, 3, 4 out in front of this data frame provides the names for the rows that R gave automatically since we did not supply those. Data frame columns and rows must have names, so if you do not name them, R will name them for you, and it's not pretty. I'm going to go ahead and put in the same data as before, but without any names. And let's use the view function to take a look at our spreadsheet, which the spreadsheet looks fine, but look at the names. Not very nice. It tried to cram everything into each column into the name here, and for this one, it just said x1.4. Much better to give data frames names in the columns. The rows are not really a big deal. They're named by the row number, so that's not a big deal. But I never create data frames where I don't give the columns a name. Now, in some versions of R, character vectors are converted to factors. We can suppress this with the strings as factors argument. So setting up the same data that I did before this way is actually safer, because if I set it up on one version of R, the way I did before without the strings as factors argument, and then on another version of R in the same way, I could get two different results. But here, this is going to be fine. It's going to keep my character vectors as characters. We could also create the vectors first and then combine them into a data frame. So here I'm going to give it the exact same data. ID will be 1 to 4. Name will be Greg, Sarah, Manuel, and Liz. And the scores 23, 27, and 29. And now I'm going to create, using the data frame function, I'm going to create my data. Let's go ahead and look at it. It's just like it was before, and the structure is as it was before. Now, talking about how some versions of R will actually change the character vector to a factor, there are also functions that will do that unless we tell it not to. A way to preserve the character vector, or any data type for that matter, is to use the I function, capital I. The capital I stands for insulate, and it prevents the vector from being changed. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to create again my 3 vectors. And now when I use the data frame function, notice name is being entered with the I in front of it. Now let's look at the structure of these data. Notice that name is not just given as a character, but given as another type of vector that we've not seen before, an as-is character. What that does is tell any function that might be willing to change this to something else in order to make the function work not to do that. It prohibits implicit coercion. So it basically says, hands off, leave this as is. Let's look at the class of my data name. It's as is. The most common way to create a data frame is by reading it in from an external file. So I'm going to do that here. I'm going to read in the statistics class data, and I'm going to put them in an object called StatData. And here's the structure of StatData. It read in my last name, first name, and score. Last name and first name are character vectors, scores an integer. If we actually viewed StatData, you can see that this is like a spreadsheet with each of the columns containing the data types that we saw when we looked at the structure command. To preserve character vectors with read.csv, regardless of our version, we can again set the strings as factors argument to false. That's just a safe way to take care of this for any version of R. Keeps everything as character vectors. Well, not everything, but character vectors stay as character vectors. Numeric will also stay as numeric. Columns can be added to a data frame by adding a named vector. So here I'm going to add gender to our data. So I'm going to add male, female, male, female. And when we look now at my data, we've added another variable to the data frame by adding a vector. We can also add columns by putting them into a data frame, and then we can bind the two data frames together. So let me create new vars. Let's look at it. That has age and whether or not the student transferred to the school. Let's bind that together using the column bind, cbind, my data and new vars. And now let's look at what we have. We've now added those two variables to our data frame. If we want to add rows to a data frame, we need to read those rows into a data frame and then bind the two data frames together with rbind. So let's read some rows in. So I'm going to give this new data the same kind of structure that I had before. That's important. So I still have ID, name, score, gender, age, and whether or not the student transferred is illogical. And now I'm going to bind my original data with the new data and store it in my data again. And so now when we look at this, we have the new rows added. If we want to change column names, we can do this with the call names function. So notice that all I'm doing here is making everything lowercase. So call names, and I have a vector now for my names of those columns. And now let's look at my data. And now you see that they're all lowercase. You can also subset using the call names in order to change just certain column names. Let's change this name to first name. So that's my data, and it is the second column. ID's the first. Remember that these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 out here in the very front are just the names of the rows. ID's the first. So the second column in my data is going to have the names, and I'm going to use the column names to change that to first name. Let's take a look. And there you go. We can change row names with the row.names function. So here I'm going to change those 6 row names from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 to 101, 102, 103, 104, 105, 106. And let's take a look. There you have it. The data.frame function will create a data frame. Data read functions such as read.csv typically create a data frame. We can use methods to preserve character vectors. We can set the strings as factors to false to preserve at that particular moment, such as when we're reading in data. But we can also insulate character vectors with the I function, turning them into an as-is class, meaning that they won't be touched in the future by functions. They'll avoid implicit coercion. Columns can be added with cbind. Rows can be added with rbind. Names can be changed. The names of columns can be changed with the call names function. The names of rows can be changed with the row.names function. But columns and rows must have names. If you don't supply them, R will, and it will not be pretty.